Congratulations, Major. The board has approved the sale of this blighted parcel to a developer. You'll receive your check after closing costs and outstanding fines are deducted. The words hung in the humid afternoon air, thick and unbelievable, buzzing around my head like the fat, lazy horseflies that danced over the cattails at the water's edge. Before me stood a woman who looked as if she had been poured into a lurid pink tracksuit and left to set. She was shaped like a belligerent pear, with a tight permed helmet of blonde hair that seemed chemically incapable of movement and a face flushed with a sense of self-importance so profound it was almost a physical force. This was Karen, president of the Lakeside Serenity Estates Homeowners Association, and she was standing on my land, my 60 acres of pristine waterfront I'd spent the last 2 decades of my military career dreaming about, holding it cheap. Corrugated plastic, soldi sign which she had just hammered into the soft earth with a small mallet she still clutched in her other hand. The sheer, unadulterated audacity of it was breathtaking, a tactical maneuver so bold and divorced from reality it belonged in a textbook on psychological warfare. I could feel the cool, familiar calm settling over me, the one I'd learned to summon in the dusty chaos of Fallujah and the tense planning rooms of Stuttgart. My heart rate didn't even flicker. I simply looked at her, then at the sign, then back at her face, which was arranged in a smug, pitying smile that suggested she was doing me a favor. Her voice, a grating alto that scraped at the tranquility of the lake, had delivered the most insane declaration I had ever heard, and yet she stood there as if she had just informed me of a bake sale. This wasn't just a threat, it was a declaration of war on my entire reality, on the very concept of ownership and the dream I had sacrificed so much to achieve. It was trying to steal my future, right in front of my eyes, with a plastic sign and a condescending smile. This is the kind of HOA nightmare you read about online, the kind that makes your blood boil. If you're watching this and you've ever had to deal with a power-tripping board member or a ridiculous violation notice, hit that subscribe button right now, because you're going to want to see how this ends. And drop a comment below telling me where you're watching from and share your own HOA horror story. It's time we all knew we aren't alone in these fights. Now back to that afternoon. Before I could even begin to process the legal and logistical impossibilities of her statement, she continued, her tone dripping with false sympathy. "Honestly, Major," she said, calling me by my retired rank as if it were some quaint, silly nickname, "it's for the best. This land has been an eyesore for years. All this overgrowth." He gestured vaguely at the ancient oaks and the thick, healthy underbrush that I saw as the soul of the property. The developer has some wonderful plans for 32 luxury townhomes, each with a guaranteed lake view. It will significantly increase the property values for everyone, including you in a way. I didn't say a word, I just let her talk, gathering intelligence, my mind working like the targeting computer on an Apache. She was outlining her entire flawed strategy, her motivations, her profound misunderstanding of the situation, and most importantly, her staggering arrogance. She genuinely believed she held this power. She thought the flimsy authority of her neighborhood committee extended beyond its manicured lawns and identical mailboxes right into the heart of my private, legally purchased, and entirely separate property. The silence stretched and her smile faltered for just a fraction of a second. She had expected sputtering, outrage, a tantrum. She was used to dealing with civilians who buckled under the slightest pressure of her imagined authority. She wasn't prepared for a man who had spent a career staring down threats far more credible than a plus-sized woman in a pink tracksuit. Finally I spoke, my voice low and even. "Karen," I said, making a point to use her name to strip away the president title she wore like armor. "Take your sign off my property now. My name is Mark Coleman, and for 25 years, I was a major in the United States Army Corps of Engineers. My life was a litany of precision, planning, and consequence. I designed and oversaw the construction of bridges in hostile territory, fortified bases against attack, and mapped out infrastructure in places most people only see on the news. Every blueprint had to be perfect. Every calculation had to be triple-checked. A mistake wasn't just a budget overrun. It was a structural failure that could cost lives. That kind of work instills in you a deep, unshakable respect for boundaries, for clearly defined lines, for the absolute authority of a surveyor's mark and a legal deed. When I retired, I had one goal: to decompress, to find a piece of the world that was unstructured, untamed, and entirely my own. My wife, Sarah, and our 2 kids had followed me across the globe, living in a series of beige houses on military bases. They deserved a permanent home, a place with roots. The dream was always the lake. I'd grown up fishing on a small lake in Minnesota. The memory of that peace was the anchor I held onto through every deployment. For 5 years before my retirement, I searched. Spent countless hours on satellite maps, county parcel viewers, and real estate websites. I wasn't looking for a house, I was looking for land. I found it in a 60-acre parcel of woods and waterfront being sold off by the estate of an old farmer named Silas Blackwood. It was perfect. It had a rolling hill that sloped gently down to nearly a quarter-mile of shoreline on a deep, clear lake. It was bordered on one side by a state forest, on another by a quiet county road, and on the third by the Lakeside Serenity estates. Before I even made an offer, I did my due diligence with the same rigor I'd apply to a bridge foundation. I spent a week at the county records office. I pulled the original plat maps for the entire area, dating back to the 1952. I examined the founding documents, the covenants, conditions, and restrictions, CC and Rs, for the Lakeside Serenity Estates, HOA. I hired a local survey company to remark the boundaries of the Blackwood property, and I stood there myself, watching them drive the iron pins into the ground. The results were unequivocal. The 60 acres I wanted to buy were never, at any point in their history, part of the HOA. They were zoned as rural, agricultural, a separate and distinct parcel, with its own legal description, its own tax ID, and a history that predated the cookie-cutter subdivision next door by a century. Silas Blackwood had sold the developer the land for the subdivision back in the 80s, but he had wisely and explicitly kept his own homestead and the 60 acres of prime waterfront for himself. It was legally firewalled, an island of freedom next to a kingdom of beige, siding, and lawn height regulations. I bought it. The closing was smooth. The deed was clean. I held in my hand the legal title to my sanctuary. For the first year, it was exactly that. I spent my days clearing brush by hand, marking out trails, and planning the perfect spot for the modest house Sarah and I would build. The kids would come home from college in the summers, and we'd camp by the water. It was quiet. It was ours. I barely interacted with the HOA next door, save for a few polite waves to people walking their dogs near my property line. And then Karen was elected HOA president. The first sign of trouble was subtle. A newsletter slipped into my mailbox on the county road, a glossy affair filled with pictures of a community barbecue and stern warnings about trash can placement on collection day. I glanced at it, saw my address was not on the distribution list, but had been handwritten on the top, and tossed it. I wasn't a member. It was junk mail. A month later, their one arrived, this time with a passive-aggressive note scrawled in red ink. Major Coleman, please be a good neighbor and manage your weeds along the fence line. I walked the fence line. The weeds were native wildflowers. On her side of the fence was a chemically treated, perfectly uniform green carpet. On my side was a thriving ecosystem. I ignored it. This was the prelude, the gentle probing of defenses, before the main assault. Karen was testing the boundaries, not of the property, but of my willingness to engage. Her mistake was in assuming my silence was weakness. In the military, you learn that the most effective response is not always the loudest one. You observe, you gather information, and you wait for the enemy to overextend. Karen, bless her power-hungry heart, was about to overextend in a way that would make the charge of the Light Brigade look like a sound, tactical decision. She saw 60 acres of untamed land, not as a beautiful, natural buffer, but as an affront to her sense of order, a rogue state on her border that refused to recognize her authority. And in her small, meticulously regulated world, such a thing could not be allowed to exist. That afternoon, as she stood there with her ridiculous old sign, I understood. This wasn't about weeds or property values. This was about power. She had manufactured a reality in her mind, where she was the queen of the lake, and I was a disobedient subject. She wasn't just trying to sell my land. She was trying to annex my reality into her own. "Take your sign off my property," I repeated, my voice dropping a half octave. "This is your only warning. The next time you trespass, I will have you removed by the sheriff." Her face, which had been a mask of smug condescension, flickered. A flash of pure, undiluted rage crossed her features before being replaced by a sneer. "You don't get to give me warnings, Major," she hissed. "This is HOA property now. The board voted. It's done. You can sue us if you like, but our lawyers are very good." She turned on her heel, leaving the sign standing like a tombstone for my dream, and waddled back toward the manicured perfection of her kingdom, the pink of her tracksuit, a vibrant mocking wound against the deep green of my woods. I watched her go, the calm still holding. I walked over to the sign, pulled it from the ground, and snapped the flimsy plastic over my knee. The sharp crack echoed over the water. The war had begun. And Karen had no idea she was fighting a man who had written the book on siege warfare. I walked back to my truck, the two halves of the broken sign in my hand, my mind already shifting from the shock of the confrontation to the cold, hard calculus of response. Karen's parting shot about her lawyers was meant to be a threat, a show of force, designed to intimidate. To me, it was a gift. It was a clear signal of her intended battleground, the legal system. And while she might have had very good lawyers on retainer, paid for by the dues of her subjects, I had something better: the truth and a career spent mastering the art of meticulous documentation. She was playing checkers, moving her pieces with loud, aggressive slaps on the board. I was about to set up a chessboard. The first move was reconnaissance. The next morning, I wasn't clearing brush or walking the shoreline. I was at the county records office at 8 a.m. sharp, waiting for the doors to open. The clerk, a kindly woman named Brenda, with whom I'd become familiar during my initial property research, greeted me with a warm smile. "Major Coleman, back so soon. Don't tell me you're buying up more of the county," she joked. "Just the opposite, Brenda," I said, my tone serious. "I'm here to defend what's already mine." I spent the next 4 hours immersed in the dry, papery world of deeds, plats, and liens. I started with my own property. I pulled the deed again, the title insurance policy, the survey I had commissioned. Everything was exactly as I remembered it. A clean title, clear boundaries, no mention of any HOA, no covenants, no restrictions beyond standard county zoning. It was a fortress of legal certainty. Then I moved on to the Lakeside Serenity estates. I pulled their master deed and the full book of their CC&Rs. I read every single line of the dense, jargon-filled document. I was looking for any clause, any loophole, any mention of annexation powers. I found it on page 47, Article 9, Section 3, annexation of additional property. It laid out a strict, multi-step procedure. It required a written petition from the owner of the property to be annexed, a supermajority vote of the existing HOA members at a specially called meeting, and the filing of a formal, supplementary declaration with the county, signed by both the petitioning landowner and the HOA board president. Karen had claimed the board voted. A board vote was only one small part of a complex process she had apparently ignored entirely. The most crucial part, the part that rendered her entire claim moot, was the first step: a written petition from me. I had, of course, submitted no such thing. My fortress had an unbreachable wall, and she was on the outside throwing pebbles at it. Just to be thorough, I asked Brenda to run a search for any and all documents filed against my parcel ID in the last year. "Looking for liens, are we?" she asked, her voice dropping conspiratorially. "That HOA next to you is notorious for it." The search came back clean. For now, no liens, no supplementary declarations, no filings of any kind. Karen's claim of a sale, her claim that my land was now HOA property, was not just a lie. It was a complete fabrication with no legal basis whatsoever. It was a fantasy she had constructed in the echo chamber of her own board meetings. Hadn't just overextended, she had invaded a sovereign nation with a water pistol. I thanked Brenda, made copies of everything. My deed, the HOA's CC&Rs with the annexation clause highlighted, the clean search result for my parcel, and left the records office feeling not relieved, but colder, more resolved. This wasn't a misunderstanding. This was a deliberate, calculated attempt at theft. The level of delusion required to attempt such a thing was staggering, but I couldn't afford to treat it as a joke. Delusional people with a taste of power were dangerous. Back at my small temporary cabin on the property, I spread the documents across the rustic wooden table my father had helped me build. This was my command center. This was the terrain map of the battlefield. My next step was to establish communication. Despite my instincts, which were screaming to ignore her and wait for her to make the next inevitably stupid move, I knew I had to create a paper trail. I drafted a letter. It was polite, professional, and utterly uncompromising. I addressed it to Karen Miller, President, Lakeside Serenity Estates, HOA, and sent copies via certified mail to the HOA's official address and to the registered agent of their corporation, a law firm downtown. The letter was simple. It stated, unambiguous terms, that my property, identified by its legal description and parcel ID, was not and had never been a part of the Lakeside Serenity Estates. It cited the specific article and section of their own CC&Rs that they had failed to follow. It informed them that their representative, Karen Miller, had trespassed on my private property and that any further incursion by any member of the HOA or its agents would result in law enforcement being called. It concluded by formally demanding that they cease and desist all claims, communications, and actions related to my property immediately. I didn't expect the letter to work. It wasn't meant to. It was a range-finding shot. It was a piece of evidence. It was me, on the record, establishing the facts and giving them a formal documented opportunity to stand down. Any action they took after receiving that letter would be taken with full knowledge of their position's illegality, which elevated their actions from merely misguided to willfully fraudulent. I drove to the post office and sent the letters, the green certified mail receipts feeling as solid and satisfying in my hand as the bolt of a well-oiled rifle. For a week there was silence. The woods were quiet. The lake was calm. I saw no sign of Karen or her minions. I almost allowed myself to think that my letter, with its cold legal finality, had been enough. Then, perhaps her lawyers had read it, sighed, and explained the concept of property law to her in small, simple words. Should have known better. Power once tasted is a drug not easily relinquished. Karen was not the type to admit a mistake. She was the type to double down, to escalate, to believe that if she just pushed hard enough, reality itself would bend to her will. The response, when it came, was not a letter. It was a full-scale barrage. It started with a single envelope tucked into my mailbox, bearing the Lakeside Serenity Estates logo. It wasn't a letter of apology. It was an invoice. My blood ran cold, not with fear, but with a surge of adrenaline. The document inside was titled Notice of Violation and Fine Assessment. It listed 3 infractions. Violation number 1. Failure to maintain landscaping to community standards. Article 5, Section 2. The fine was $500. Violation number 2. Unapproved overgrowth and natural debris creating a fire hazard. Article Fivier, Section 4. The fine was $1,000. Violation number 3. Failure to submit architectural plans for new construction prior to land clearing. Article 5, Section 1. The fine was a staggering $2,500. Total due, $4,000. A note at the bottom, in the same red ink I'd seen before, read, payable within 30 days. These fines will be deducted from the proceeds of the property sale if not paid. Was signed, with a flourish, by Karen. The sheer, glorious insanity of it was almost beautiful. She was citing articles and sections from her CC and Rs as if they applied to me, as if her power extended by sheer force of will. She wasn't just ignoring my cease and desist, she was using it as a scorecard, fining me for the very things that made my land mine and not hers. The unapproved overgrowth was my forest. The land clearing was me pulling invasive buckthorn by hand. It was a masterclass in bureaucratic warfare. My first instinct was to tear it up. My second was to frame it. Instead, I did what I always do. I filed it. It went into a new expanding accordion folder labeled Karen. 2 days later, another envelope arrived. This one contained photos. Someone had stood at my property line and taken pictures of a pile of brush I had cleared, of the wildflowers near the fence, of the spot where I planned to build my house. It felt invasive, a violation. The accompanying letter was even more unhinged. It was a second notice, this time adding a new fine for improper storage of yard waste, $250, and a daily non-compliance penalty of $100 per Dalton Y, retroactive to the date of the first notice. The total was now climbing into the stratosphere. She was trying to bury me in paper, to create a fictional debt so large it would seem real. I didn't respond. I just filed it. My silence seemed to enrage her. The notices started coming every other day. Unapproved vehicle parked on property. My 10-year-old Ford 150. Nuisance animal habitat. A family of deer I enjoyed watching. Failure to install regulation mailbox. I was on a county road with a standard USPS-approved box. The fines were arbitrary, vindictive, and completely untethered from any logical or legal foundation. I felt like a biologist observing a strange, exotic creature in its natural habitat. The creature was hostile, logical, but also fascinatingly predictable. Every action was an escalation. Every move was designed to provoke a reaction. And my refusal to react was driving her into a frenzy. The culmination of this paper assault arrived a month after the first notice. It was a thicker envelope, sent via certified mail, which I signed for with a grim sense of anticipation. It wasn't an invoice. It was a notice of lien. My heart for the first time did a little jump. This was a significant escalation. A fine is a demand for money. A lien is a legal claim against property. The document stated that due to my failure to pay $17,850 in accumulated fines and penalties, the Lakeside Serenity Estates, HOA, had placed a lien on my property. This meant that, in their view, I could not sell or refinance the property without paying them first. It also meant that, if the debt went unpaid, they could theoretically initiate foreclosure proceedings. Fraudulent foreclosure proceedings. But foreclosure proceedings nonetheless. This was the nuclear option. This was Karen moving from harassment to a direct, tangible attack on my ownership. This was no longer about paper tigers. This was a claw mark on the title of my land. I immediately called the county records office. "Brenda," I said, my voice tight. "It's Mark Coleman. Can you check my parcel ID for new filings?" Specifically, a lien. I could hear her typing. A few moments passed. "Oh, honey," she said, her voice filled with a weary sympathy I was coming to appreciate. "You've been hit. Filed yesterday afternoon. Lakeside, Serenity Estates, Homeowners Association, Claim amount: $17,850. Closed my eyes. So, she'd actually done it. She had filed a fraudulent legal document with the county. This was no longer a private dispute. She had crossed a bright, shining line and involved a government agency in her scam. She had taken her fantasy and tried to codify it into public record. "Thanks, Brenda," I said. "Could you email me a copy of the filing?" "Already on its way, Major," she replied. "And Mark, be careful. That woman is poison." I hung up the phone and looked out the window at my land. The sun was setting over the lake, painting the water in hues of orange and purple. Doe and her fawn stepped cautiously from the tree line to drink at the water's edge. This was what I was fighting for. This peace. This reality. Karen had tried to sell it. She had tried to fine it into submission, and now she was trying to legally encumber it with a fraudulent claim. She had made a critical error. She thought the lien was her checkmate. She didn't realize she had just handed me the single most powerful piece of evidence I could have asked for. The fraudulent lien wasn't a weapon against me. It was a confession, signed, notarized, and filed for all the world to see. It was the key to her own destruction. The game had changed. It was time to stop playing defense. It was time to go on the attack. The fraudulent lien was the tripwire. It transformed the situation from a bizarre harassment campaign into a clear-cut case of property fraud. My period of observation was over. It was time to actively engage, but my first move wasn't to a lawyer's office. It was to the neighborhood itself. I needed to understand the terrain of Karen's kingdom, to see if I was the only one in her crosshairs. An enemy's patterns of behavior are a roadmap to their weaknesses. I spent a Saturday morning walking, not on my own land, but on the public sidewalks of Lakeside Serenity Estates. It was Stepford perfect. Every lawn was a uniform shade of green. Every mailbox was an identical black metal box on an identical white post. Every house was painted in one of 3 approved shades of beige. It felt less like a community and more like a minimum security prison for the aesthetically timid. I was looking for cracks in the facade. I found the first one near the community park. An elderly man was on his hands and knees, meticulously pulling tiny clover sprouts from his lawn. He looked up as I approached, his face a mask of weary resignation. "Morning," I said. "Beautiful day," he grunted, sitting back on his heels. "It is if you like spending it on your knees, appeasing the queen." "The queen?" I asked, feigning ignorance. "Karen," he said, spitting the name out like a piece of spoiled meat. "Our glorious president. I got a notice yesterday. Clover infestation, $50 fine if it's not gone by Monday." He shook his head, his hands stained with dirt and chlorophyll. "I'm 82 years old. I fought in Vietnam, and I'm spending my golden years fighting clover, because a woman with nothing better to do has a vendetta against it." This was my opening. "My name's Mark," I said, extending a hand. "I own the land next door. Karen's been sending me some letters, too." The man's eyes lit up with a mixture of sympathy and morbid curiosity. He introduced himself as George Henderson. We talked for 20 minutes. He and his wife, Mary, had lived here for 30 years, long before Karen's reign. He told me about the constant stream of petty violations. His wife's bird feeder was a rodent attractant, $100 fine. Their garden gnome was an unapproved lawn ornament, $75 fine. Their flag, a U.S. Marine Corps flag he flew beneath the American flag, was non-compliant with community aesthetic standards. A warning for now. It was a war of 1,000 paper cuts, designed to grind down the residents' will to resist. "She gets a thrill from it," George said, his voice low. "The power. Most people just pay. It's easier than fighting." "But she's trying to sell your land?" That's a new level of crazy even for her. He told me to talk to the Millers in 34 Serenity Lane. They had a young family and were in Karen's sights. I found the Miller house easily. It was the only one with a brightly colored plastic play set in the backyard. A young woman, probably in her early 30s, was pushing a little girl on a swing. I introduced myself, and as soon as I mentioned Karen's name, her face tightened. "Are you the guy with the woods?" she asked. "She's been talking about you in the newsletters." "The blighted parcel acquisition project." "That's me," I confirmed. "She's trying to fine you for that playset, isn't she?" Her eyes widened. "How did you know?" "It's a pattern," I said. "It's not about the rules. It's about control." Her name was Emily Miller. She and her husband had been fighting with Karen for 6 months over the playset. It was, according to Karen, an unapproved permanent structure. They had been fined over $1,000 so far. "We bought this house so our kids could have a yard to play in," Emily said, her voice trembling with frustration. "Now I feel like I'm constantly being watched." She drives by slowly, taking pictures. My daughter asked me if the mean lady was going to take her swing away. The story was the same, just a different verse. Karen targeted the vulnerable, the new, and anyone who dared to express a shred of individuality. George was targeted for his age and his stubborn pride. The Millers were targeted for their youth and the joyful chaos of children. I was targeted for owning something she coveted. It wasn't about enforcing rules for the good of the community. It was about wielding power for the thrill of dominance. I spent the rest of the day talking to 4 other families, each with a similar story. A retired teacher fined for having wind chimes. A gay couple told their rainbow flag for Pride Month was a political statement not in keeping with the neighborhood's neutral character. A family who had their son's basketball hoop confiscated from their driveway because it was left out overnight. A clear picture was emerging. This was not a functional HOA. It was a fiefdom run by a petty tyrant. The residents weren't members. They were subjects. They were isolated, picked off one by one, made to feel like they were the only ones causing trouble. Karen's strength came from this isolation. My strategy became clear. I had to break it. I had to unite them. I got everyone's phone number. That evening, I created a group text. I kept the message simple. "This is Mark Coleman. We've all spoken today about our shared issues with the HOA board's practices. There is strength in numbers. I am scheduling a meeting to discuss a unified strategy. Please let me know if you're interested." The replies came in almost instantly. "Yes, we're in. About time someone did something. Thank you." George Henderson's reply was the most emphatic. "You lead, Major, we'll follow." An alliance was forming. The seeds of a rebellion were being sown right under the nose of the Queen, in the heart of her own perfect beige kingdom. Karen thought she was fighting one man. He was about to find out she had declared war on a community. With the beginnings of a neighborhood alliance in place, my next step was to secure my legal arsenal. I knew I couldn't fight a legal battle based on righteous anger and group texts alone. I needed a professional, someone who could translate our outrage into the cold, unforgiving language of the law. I didn't want a standard property lawyer who would simply write a stern letter and try to negotiate the lien away. I needed a shark. I found her through a recommendation from a fellow veteran in my old unit. Her name was Jessica Riley, a former JAG officer who had left the military to open her own private practice. Her firm's website was stark and professional, but her bio had a line that caught my eye: specializing in complex litigation, contract disputes, and holding bullies accountable. I scheduled a consultation. I walked into her downtown office, a modern space with glass walls and a view of the city skyline, carrying my accordion folder, which was now bulging with documents. Jessica was sharp, focused, and had an aura of no-nonsense competence that was instantly familiar and reassuring. She had short-cropped, dark hair, intelligent eyes that missed nothing, and she didn't waste time with pleasantries. "Major Coleman," she said, shaking my hand firmly. "Read your initial email. It sounds ambitious, even for an HOA president. Let's see what you've got." For the next hour, I laid it all out on her large conference table. The deed, the survey, the HOA's CC&Rs with the annexation clause highlighted, the initial salt sign incident, The escalating series of violation notices, each one more absurd than the last. The photos taken of my property, my certified cease and desist letter, and finally, the pièce de résistance, the fraudulent lien filed with the county. Arrange them chronologically, paper trail of escalating madness. Jessica listened without interruption, her expression transitioning from professional curiosity to raised eyebrow disbelief, and finally to a grim, focused intensity that I recognized. It was the look of a predator that has just spotted a wounded, slow-moving target. She picked up the notice of lien, holding it by the edges as if it were contaminated. She actually filed this, she said half to herself. She had a lawyer, or at least a notary, sign off on this and submitted it as a legitimate legal instrument. She looked up at me, a slow, dangerous smile spreading across her face. Mark, this is magnificent. This is the rope. She's not just harassing you. She's committing slander of title. She's likely engaged in mail fraud by sending these demands, and filing a knowingly false instrument with a government office is a felony in this state. I felt a wave of vindication wash over me. So, we get the lien removed? I asked. Jessica laughed a short, sharp bark. Oh, we'll get it removed, but that's thinking too small. Removing the lien is like shooting a lone enemy soldier. I'm interested in taking out their command and control. We don't just want to make this go away. We want to make them pay, and we want to make sure they can never do this to you or anyone else again. This was why I'd hired her. Her strategy was brilliant and ruthless. We don't sue yet, she explained, leaning forward. Suing now tips our hand. Karen gets a lawyer. They circle the wagons, and it becomes a long, expensive slog. Right now, she's arrogant. She thinks she's winning. We let her think that. We let her keep digging her own grave, and we just keep handing her bigger shovels. The plan had 3 phases. Phase 1, evidence fortification. Jessica advised me to install high-quality, motion-activated security cameras with audio recording capabilities covering all access points to my property. If she or her agents trespass again, I want it in high-definition 4K, she said. She also had me draft a formal affidavit, a sworn statement under penalty of perjury, detailing every interaction, every letter, every conversation, with dates and times. I was also to get signed affidavits from George Henderson, the Millers, and the other victimized neighbors, detailing their own experiences of harassment and selective enforcement. This would establish a clear pattern of abuse, transforming my case from a one-off property dispute into a class-action-worthy conspiracy. Phase 2, corporate and financial investigation. Jessica's team would start a deep dive into the Lakeside Serenity Estates HOA as a corporate entity. They would pull their tax records, their annual reports, their meeting minutes, anything publicly available. HOAs like this run by tyrants are often a mess financially, she explained. I want to know where the money from these bogus fines is going. I want to know if the board members are paying themselves. I want to know who their lawyer is and what kind of advice he's giving them. And most importantly, she wanted to investigate the developer Karen claimed to have sold my land to. That's a loose thread that could unravel everything, she said. Phase 3, the trap. Once we have an ironclad case, Jessica concluded, her eyes gleaming, we don't just file a lawsuit, we coordinate. We take our evidence package to the district attorney's office for the criminal charges, the fraud, the forgery. We take it to the state real estate board. And we file a civil suit so devastating it will bankrupt her personally and gut the HOA's ability to operate. But we only pull that trigger when she's at her most vulnerable, at the moment of her greatest arrogance. I left her office feeling 10 feet tall. The weight of the fight hadn't lifted, but it had shifted. It was no longer just me against a crazy woman. It was a coordinated legal operation against a criminal enterprise. I spent the next week executing Phase 1. I installed the cameras, their dark lenses, silently watching the tree line. I spent hours on the phone with George, Emily, and the others, coaching them on how to write their affidavits, how to stick to the facts, how to be precise. The documents they sent back were heartbreaking and infuriating, a chronicle of years of petty tyranny and financial extortion. I compiled them all into a neat indexed binder. Every day another violation notice would arrive from Karen, the fines now totaling well over $30,000. I no longer saw them as harassment, I saw them as exhibits. Each envelope was another nail she was hammering into her own coffin. I just smiled, dated them, and slipped them into my folder, right on schedule. The trap was being set. The bait was my silence. And Karen, blinded by her own hubris, was walking right into it. The investigation phase, led by Jessica's formidable team, began to yield fruit almost immediately. Her paralegal, a young man with the digital forensic skills of a government spy, started with the developer. Karen had been vague, mentioning only a prestigious firm specializing in luxury waterfront properties. A few hours of digging through state business filings turned up the truth. The developer was a limited liability company, or LLC, named Lakeside Premier Homes. It had been formed just 3 months prior. It had no website, no portfolio of previous work, no registered office beyond a P.O. box in a neighboring town. It was a ghost. The real discovery, the one that made Jessica call me with an audible thrill in her voice, was the name of the LLC's registered agent and sole member, a man named Gerald Finney. "Does that name mean anything to you, Mark?" she asked. "No, should it?" "Do a quick social media search for Karen Miller's family," she instructed. It took me less than 5 minutes. Karen's sister, Darlene, was married to a man named Gerald Jerry Finney. The developer who was supposedly buying my land for a multi-million-dollar project was Karen's own brother-in-law, operating through a shell company created just for this purpose. This wasn't just an attempt to force a sale. This was a conspiracy to steal my land and hand it over to her own family. The plan was likely simple: use the fraudulent lien and the mountain of bogus fines to initiate a foreclosure, have the HOA buy the property at a share of sale for pennies on the dollar, the cost of the debt, and then sell it for a massive profit to her brother-in-law's company. My check, after closing costs and outstanding fines, would have been zero. In fact, I probably would have owed them money. "This moves it from civil fraud to a criminal conspiracy," Jessica said, her voice grimly satisfied. "Racketeering. This is RICO territory. They are using an organization, the HOA, to conduct a pattern of illegal activity for financial gain." The pieces were clicking into place, forming a picture far darker than I had imagined. Karen wasn't just a power-drunk busybody. She was a would-be crime boss, using HOA bylaws as her weapon of choice. The next breakthrough came from the county records, but it wasn't something we found. It was something that was filed. One of Jessica's alerts pinged her email. A new document had been recorded against my parcel ID. It was titled Supplementary Declaration of Annexation. My blood went cold. This was the document required by the HOA's own CC&Rs to formally annex a property. I read the scanned PDF Jessica forwarded me. It was a formal declaration stating that the property described by my parcel ID was now officially part of the Lakeside Serenity estates, subject to all its covenants and restrictions. It was signed at the bottom by Karen Miller as HOA president. And next to her signature was another, a shaky, spidery script under the line, "For the petitioning landowner." The name read, Silas Blackwood. Silas Blackwood. The old farmer who had sold me the land, the man from whose estate I had purchased the property. A quick search of public records confirmed what I already knew. Silas Blackwood had died 2.5 years ago, at the age of 91. Quote, "The signature on the document, which had been notarized just 1 week prior, was a forgery. A clumsy, obvious, and utterly damning forgery. They had faked the signature of a dead man. They had found a corrupt or incompetent notary to stamp it, and they had filed it with the county as a legitimate legal document. This was the smoking gun. This was the point of no return. It was proof of a calculated, premeditated criminal act. Karen and her conspirators had become so confident, so certain of their own power and my inaction, that they had committed a felony in broad daylight and filed it as a public record. "They're getting sloppy," Jessica said, when I called her, my voice tight with a cold fury. "They believe their own lies. They've created this narrative where your land belongs to them, and now they're just manufacturing the paperwork to make it official. They probably forged this, thinking it would be the final nail in your coffin before they file for foreclosure." She paused, and I could almost hear the gears turning in her head. "We have them, Mark. We have them on conspiracy, mail fraud, slander of title, and now forgery and filing a false instrument. We have everything we need to burn their entire world to the ground. The final piece of intelligence came from an unexpected source." George Henderson called me his voice, a conspiratorial whisper. "Mark, you're not going to believe this. Karen just sent out a special announcement. She's calling an emergency all-hands HOA meeting for next Tuesday night." "What for?" I asked, my heart beginning to pound. "Get this," George said, and I could hear the incredulous anger in his voice. "The agenda is a single item, a special presentation and celebration of the successful acquisition of the adjacent north parcel and the unveiling of the preliminary development plan for the Lakeside Premier Homes townhome project." She was taking a victory lap. She was going to stand in front of the entire community and announce her triumph, her successful conquest of my land. She was going to present her brother-in-law's sham development as a boon for the community. She had no idea that we knew about the shell company. She had no idea that we knew the annexation document was a forgery. She was throwing her own surprise party, and she had no idea who the guests of honor would be. "Jessica," I said into the phone moments later, "change of plans. We're not going to the DA first. We're going to a party." The trap was no longer passive. It was about to be sprung, not in a quiet courtroom, but in the full glare of a public forum, right in the heart of Karen's own kingdom. The moment of her greatest arrogance was at hand, and we were going to be there to help her celebrate. The week leading up to the HOA meeting was a blur of focused preparation. This was no longer just about legal filings. It was about staging a public reckoning. Jessica and I worked like a military planning cell, preparing for a decisive operation. Our objective was not just to present facts, but to dismantle Karen's authority, piece by piece, in front of the very people she ruled over. We didn't want a chaotic shouting match. We wanted a clinical, undeniable, public execution of her credibility. Our primary weapon was a PowerPoint presentation. It sounds mundane, but in Jessica's hands, it was a tool of devastating precision. Each slide was a kill shot. Slide 1. A high-resolution satellite image of the area, with my 60-acre parcel outlined in red and the Lakeside Serenity estates in blue. The title read, "A Question of Boundaries." Slide 2. A scanned image of my warranty deed, clean and absolute. Slide 3. The relevant page from the HOA's own CC and ARS, with the strict multi-step annexation clause highlighted in yellow. Slide 4. A timeline of the harassment, showing the dates of the first trespassing incident, the sold sign, and the dozens of violation notices. We even included a running total of the fraudulent fines, which now exceeded $40,000. Slide 5. The fraudulent lien. A big red fraudulent stamp was superimposed over it. Slide 6. The Lakeside Premier Homes, LLC, corporate filing showing the date of its creation and the name of its sole member, Gerald Finney. Slide 7. A screenshot from Facebook showing a smiling Karen with her arm around her brother-in-law, Jerry Finney. The caption from Karen's own post read, "So proud of my amazing brother-in-law Jerry on his new business venture. Big things coming." And then, the finale. Slide 8. The supplementary declaration of annexation they had filed. Slide 9. a side-by-side comparison of the shaky forged Silas Blackwood's signature on the annexation document and Silas Blackwood's actual, vigorous signature from my deed, which he had signed just before his health declined. The differences were stark and undeniable. Slide 10. A scanned copy of Silas Blackwood's official death certificate. Date of death, 2.5 years ago. Beneath it, in huge bold letters, how can a dead man sign a legal document? We had large format printouts made of the most critical documents: the forged signature, death certificate, the LLC filing. George Henderson, Emily Miller, and the other members of our little rebellion each had a role. They would be seated strategically throughout the room. They weren't to speak until I gave them a subtle nod. Their job was to corroborate, to stand up and lend their own voices to the pattern of abuse once the foundation of fact had been laid. The final piece of the plan was the most critical. Jessica made a call. Not to the DA, but to a personal contact she had in the county sheriff's department, a detective in the economic crimes unit. She didn't file a formal report. He simply had a professional courtesy conversation. She explained that she had a client who was the victim of an ongoing, large-scale fraud, that the perpetrators were about to publicly incriminate themselves at a meeting, and that the evidence was overwhelming. He gave the detective the time and address of the meeting and suggested that having a couple of uniformed officers nearby, perhaps in the parking lot on a routine patrol, might be prudent in case the situation escalated. The detective, intrigued by the sheer brazenness of the scheme, agreed. He saw the potential for a clean, simple arrest where the suspects confessed in front of dozens of witnesses. The night of the meeting, the air in the community clubhouse was thick with a strange electric tension. The room was packed, far more so than for a typical HOA meeting. Karen had billed this as a landmark event, and the residents had turned out, some with curiosity, some with the weary obedience of long-term subjects. Karen stood at a podium at the front of the room, beaming. She was wearing a flowing floral print dress that seemed to serve as a victory flag. Next to her were the other two members of the board's executive committee, a timid-looking man named Bob and a severe-looking woman named Patricia, both of whom looked like they were merely basking in Karen's reflected glory. My team and I filed in and took our seats. Jessica, in a sharp business suit, sat next to me, her laptop ready. George and Mary Henderson sat near the front, their faces grimly determined. The Millers and the others were scattered throughout the crowd. Karen spotted me, and a flicker of triumphant malice crossed her face. She saw my presence not as a threat, but as the final humiliation of her vanquished foe. I had come to watch her victory. I gave her a small, neutral nod. The meeting began. Karen tapped the microphone, the sound screeching for a moment before settling. "Welcome, everyone. Welcome to a truly historic night for Lakeside Serenity Estates," she boomed, her voice radiating smug satisfaction. For years, we have lived next to a parcel of land that has been, to put it mildly, an unkempt blemish on our otherwise beautiful community. She went on for 10 minutes, a long, self-congratulatory monologue about her vision, her dedication, and the difficult but necessary actions the board had taken to secure the future of our neighborhood. He spoke of blight and fire hazards and depressed property values. She was painting a picture of herself as a hero, a savior who had rescued the community from the stubborn negligence of an outsider. Then came the big announcement. "And so it is with immense pride," she declared, her voice swelling, "that I can officially announce that the board has successfully completed the annexation of the north parcel and has already secured a contract with a prestigious developer, Lakeside Premier Homes, to turn that wasteland into a beautiful, value-enhancing townhome community." A smattering of polite, confused applause rippled through the room. Karen gestured to a large easel next to her, which held a concept drawing of generic-looking townhomes. "And now, I'd like to unveil the vision for our future." This was my cue. As she basked in the glow of her supposed triumph, I stood up. "Excuse me, Karen," I said, my voice calm but carrying easily through the suddenly silent room. "Before you continue, I believe there are a few details about this successful acquisition that the community deserves to hear." Karen's face went from triumphant to thunderous in a heartbeat. The entire room turned to look at me. The air crackled. "You are out of order, Major," she snarled, her voice dripping with venom. "This is a presentation, not a public forum. Sit down." "I will not," I said, my voice remaining level. "Because you are not presenting a vision for the future. You are confessing to a series of crimes in front of this entire community. And I have the receipts." A collective gasp went through the room. Jessica, on cue, hit the first slide on her laptop, which was connected to the projector Karen had intended to use for her own presentation. My satellite map, with my land outlined in red, flashed onto the large screen behind Karen's head. She spun around, her face a mask of confusion and rage. "What is this? Who authorized this? Turn that off," she shrieked, but no one moved. All eyes were on the screen. "Ladies and gentlemen," began, my voice clear and steady, addressing the crowd directly. "My name is Mark Coleman. I am the legal and sole owner of the 60-acre parcel of land Karen is referring to. What she has just told you is not a success story. It is a lie. And I'm going to show you exactly how deep a lie goes." I walked to the front of the room, standing a few feet away from the podium, creating a clear focal point for the audience. "Let's start with the basics," I said as Jessica clicked to the next slide. My deed appeared on the screen. This is my warranty deed. It shows that I purchased the land from the estate of Silas Blackwood. It is a clean title, with no encumbrances and no connection whatsoever to the Lakeside Serenity Estates HOA. Click. The HOA's own annexation rules appeared. According to your own rules, annexing a property requires a written petition from the landowner. I was never asked, and I certainly never petitioned to have my land absorbed into this organization. Whispers started to ripple through the crowd. Karen's face was becoming a mottled shade of crimson. "This is slander. These are lies," she sputtered, but her voice lacked conviction. It was the bluster of someone whose narrative was collapsing. "Lies?" I asked, my voice hardening. "Let's talk about lies." Click. The screen showed the notice of lien. Karen and her board filed this fraudulent lien against my property for over $17,000 in bogus fines for things like unapproved overgrowth on my own private forest. This is a crime called slander of title. Click. The LLC filing for Lakeside Premier Homes appeared. And who is the prestigious developer? She sold my land to a shell company, formed 3 months ago, owned by this man. Click. The Facebook photo of Karen and her brother-in-law Jerry flashed on the screen. The whispers in the room grew into a loud murmur. People were turning to each other, their faces a mixture of shock and dawning comprehension. "Her own brother-in-law?" I said, letting the words hang in the air. "She tried to steal my land to enrich her own family." "It's not true," Karen screamed, her voice cracking. "This is a conspiracy against me." But the final blow was yet to come. "A conspiracy, Karen?" I asked, my voice dropping to an icy calm. "Let's talk about real conspiracies." Jessica clicked to the next slide. The forged annexation document appeared on the screen, the shaky signature of Silas Blackwood clearly visible. "This is the document Karen filed with the county last week to legally annex my land. Supposedly signed by the previous owner Silas Blackwood." I paused, letting everyone in the room read the name. I looked over at George and Mary Henderson. Mary had known Silas for 50 years. Her hand went to her mouth. "But there's a problem with that," I continued, my voice resonating with cold fury. Jessica clicked one last time. The death certificate filled the screen. The date of death was stark, official, and undeniable. Silas Blackwood died 2.5 years ago. The room fell into a stunned, absolute silence. You could have heard a pin drop. The only sound was a choked gasp from Karen's direction. The entire scheme, the whole edifice of her power and arrogance, had been obliterated in 10 minutes with a handful of public records. "You forged a dead man's signature," I said, my voice low and accusatory, pointing a finger directly at her. "You committed a felony and filed it as a public document to try and steal my property." At that moment, George Henderson stood up, his voice shaking with an old man's righteous anger. "And she's been doing it to us for years, fining us, harassing us, for bird feeders and clover. She fined us $100 because my wife's roses were encroaching on the sidewalk." Emily Miller stood up, her voice trembling but clear. "She's been trying to take away my children's playset, fining us thousands of dollars, making my daughter afraid to play in her own yard." One by one our allies stood, their voices joining a chorus of grievance and anger. The dam of fear had broken, the community was finding its voice. Karen stood there, cornered, her face pale and sweaty. Her co-conspirators on the board, Bob and Patricia, were slowly backing away from her, their faces aghast as they realized the depth of the criminality they had been complicit in. Karen's eyes darted around the room, looking for an escape, for an ally, but she found only a sea of accusing faces. Her reign was over. The public execution was complete. And then, as if on cue, the double doors at the back of the clubhouse swung open. 2 uniformed sheriff's deputies stepped inside, their presence instantly commanding the room's attention. They weren't there on a routine patrol anymore. They walked slowly and deliberately down the center aisle, their eyes fixed on the podium. The trap had been sprung, the checkmate was at hand. The arrival of the sheriff's deputies sucked all the remaining oxygen out of the room. The chaotic murmuring ceased, replaced by a heavy, watchful silence. The deputies didn't rush. They moved with a calm, deliberate authority that was far more intimidating than any show of force. One deputy, a tall man with a grim expression, kept his eyes on the crowd, a silent warning against any interference. The other, a woman with a sharp, intelligent face, walked directly towards the podium, her gaze locked on Karen. Her eyes flickered to the death certificate still projected on the screen behind the crumbling HOA president, then back to Karen's ashen face. The connection was made. The public accusation was now an official matter. Karen, who just minutes before had been the undisputed queen of her domain, looked small and pathetic. The floral dress that had seemed like a victory flag now looked like a cheap shroud. She opened her mouth, then closed it, a fish gasping for air. The power she had wielded so ruthlessly was an illusion, and it had just evaporated under the harsh lights of scrutiny and the law. "Karen Miller," the female deputy asked, her voice polite but firm, carrying a weight of finality. Karen just nodded, unable to speak. "We need you to come with us. We have some questions for you down at the station regarding a few documents filed with the county." The deputy's gaze flickered meaningfully towards Bob and Patricia, who both looked as if they were about to be physically ill. "You two as well. We need to get your statements." Tricia began to stammer. I had no idea. I just signed what she told me to sign. I thought it was all standard procedure." Bob just stared at his shoes, his face the color of old parchment. "You'll have plenty of time to explain your level of involvement," the deputy said, her tone leaving no room for argument. She turned back to Karen. "Please put your hands behind your back." The sound of the handcuffs clicking shut was shockingly loud in the silent room. It was a crisp, metallic finality, the sound of a chapter ending, of a tyrant falling. As the deputies led a now sobbing Karen and her 2 pale-faced lieutenants out of the clubhouse, the residents watched in stunned silence. They were witnessing the impossible, the untouchable, all-powerful president being led away in disgrace. As the doors closed behind them, the room erupted. It wasn't a celebration, not yet. It was a collective exhalation of breath, release of years of pent-up frustration, fear, and resentment. People were talking, all at once, looking at me, at Jessica, at the screen, trying to process the magnitude of the collapse they had just witnessed. George Henderson walked over and clapped me on the shoulder, his eyes wet with tears. "You did it, son," he said, his voice thick with emotion. "You gave us our neighborhood back." The local news, tipped off by Jessica's office with a press advisory about a major fraud bust at a local HOA, arrived just in time to capture footage of Karen being placed in the back of a patrol car. The story was on the 11 o'clock news that night, and by the next morning, it was all over the local papers and websites. HOA president arrested in forgery and fraud scheme to steal land. My name was kept out of it, at my request. I was referred to only as a retired veteran and landowner, but everyone in Lakeside Serenity Estates knew. The legal fallout was swift and brutal. With the evidence we provided, the affidavits, the financial trail, the forged document, and the dozens of witnesses from the meeting, the district attorney's office had an open and shut case. Karen, Jerry Finney, and the notary who had stamped the forged document were charged with multiple felonies, including forgery, filing a false instrument, and conspiracy to commit fraud. Faced with the mountain of evidence, Bob and Patricia, the other board members, quickly flipped, agreeing to testify against Karen in exchange for lesser charges. Their testimony painted a picture of Karen as a complete autocrat who controlled the board through intimidation and deceit, assuring them that all her actions were vetted by our lawyers. It turned out the HOA's law firm had repeatedly warned Karen in writing that her actions regarding my property were legally indefensible and that she should stand down, advice she had completely ignored. Those letters, subpoenaed by the DA, became another pillar of the prosecution's case, proving willful intent. While the criminal case proceeded, Jessica launched the civil offensive. She filed a massive lawsuit, not just on my behalf, but as a class action representing George Henderson, the Millers, and a dozen other families who had been systematically extorted by Karen's fine, happy regime. The suit named Karen Miller, personally, her brother-in-law Jerry, the HOA itself, and even the HOA's insurance company. We sued for slander of title, damages from the conspiracy, emotional distress, and we sought to have every fine levied under Karen's presidency reviewed and refunded. We also filed for an immediate injunction to have the fraudulent lien on my property expunged from the record and to freeze all of the HOA's operational and reserve accounts pending a full forensic audit. The judge, after reviewing the initial evidence, granted the injunction immediately. The HOA was, for all intents and purposes, paralyzed. Their bank accounts were frozen. They couldn't pay their landscaping company, their management firm, or their lawyers. Their insurance carrier, faced with our lawsuit and the undeniable evidence of willful criminal acts by the board president, sent the HOA a notice of non-renewal, effectively canceling their directors' and officers' liability policy. The organization was in a death spiral. Karen, out on bail and facing financial ruin in prison time, became a pariah. Her husband left her. Her friends in the neighborhood wouldn't even make eye contact with her. The house she had ruled from, with its perfectly manicured lawn, now had a "for sale" sign. Out front, a real one this time. The community, free from her oppressive oversight, began to change almost overnight. People started putting up bird feeders and wind chimes. The Miller Kids playset became a neighborhood fixture. George Henderson stopped fighting clover and instead planted a small, beautiful vegetable garden in his front yard, a defiant act of productive freedom. The beige kingdom was starting to find its color again. The final act of this drama played out not in a dramatic courtroom showdown, but in a series of quiet, decisive legal victories. Karen Miller, facing the prospect of a long prison sentence, accepted a plea deal. She pleaded guilty to felony forgery and fraud. She was sentenced to 2 years in state prison, 5 years of probation, and was ordered to pay restitution. Her brother-in-law, Jerry, also pleaded guilty to conspiracy charges, receiving probation and a hefty fine that effectively bankrupted his sham development company before it ever broke ground. The notary lost his license permanently and was charged with perjury. The criminal justice system had worked. On the civil side, the victory was even more complete. The HOA, leaderless, uninsured, and facing a catastrophic class action lawsuit, had no choice but to surrender. Their new interim board, hastily appointed by a judge, entered into settlement negotiations with Jessica. The result was a stunning capitulation. The fraudulent lien was, of course, expunged. My legal fees were paid in full. I received a substantial settlement for the slander of title and the harassment I had endured. But the victory went far beyond that. As part of the class action settlement, the HOA was forced to undergo a complete forensic audit of the past 5 years of its finances. The audit revealed that Karen had been using the fines she collected as a personal slush fund, paying for lavish board dinners, community supplies that were never purchased, and consulting fees to friends. The court ordered that all fines collected during her presidency that were not related to actual material damages be refunded to the residents. Over $100,000 was returned to the people from whom it had been extorted. The settlement also mandated a complete overhaul of the HOA's governing documents. The vague, weaponized clauses about community standards and aesthetics were rewritten to be specific and objective. A new, transparent fine and appeals process was established, requiring multiple warnings and a hearing before an independent arbiter. The power to levy 6-figure fines for wildflowers was gone forever. The most satisfying part of the settlement, for me, was the election. The court ordered a new, supervised election for the board of directors. It didn't run. My land was, and always would be, separate. But I watched from the sidelines as the community, now engaged and empowered, took control of its own destiny. George Henderson, the 82-year-old Clover warrior, was nominated to be the new president. He ran on a simple platform: common sense, common decency, and leave people alone. Won in a landslide. The first official act of the new board under President Henderson was to pass a resolution formally apologizing to me and my family. The second was to dissolve the Architectural Review Committee for good. Lakeside Serenity Estates was finally on the road to becoming a community, not a prison. A year later, I stood on the deck of the house that Sarah and I had finally built. It wasn't a mansion. It was a modest but beautiful cedar and stone home, nestled perfectly into the hillside, with large windows overlooking the lake. The unapproved overgrowth I'd been fined for was now the stunning, mature forest that framed our view. The nuisance animal habitat was the reason we could sit on our deck in the morning with a cup of coffee and watch deer, foxes, and even a bald eagle that had taken up residence in one of the tall pines by the shore. The land was at peace. My family was home. My son, home from college for the summer, was down at the small dock we'd built, casting a line into the clear, still water. My daughter was reading in a hammock strung between 2 ancient oaks. Sarah came out and stood beside me, wrapping an arm around my waist. "It's perfect," she said, leaning her head on my shoulder. "It was worth the fight." I looked out over the water, past my own shoreline, to the houses of Lakeside Serenity Estates next door. I could see bright flowers in yards, a canoe pulled up on a small beach, a rainbow flag flying proudly from a pole. It looked like a neighborhood now, a place where people actually lived instead of just complied. My fight had never really been about the 60 acres. It was about the principle. It was about the fundamental right to be left alone, to own a piece of the world without some self-appointed tyrant trying to take it from you through lies and intimidation. Karen had tried to steal my dream, but in her arrogance, she had handed me the tools to dismantle her entire corrupt empire. She had inadvertently become a liberator. Her downfall had freed, not just me, but an entire community that had forgotten it had a voice. The satisfaction I felt wasn't a gloating triumph. It was a deep, quiet contentment, the feeling a craftsman gets when a complex project is finally complete, when all the joints are tight and all the lines are true. We had faced down a bully, not with anger and shouting, but with precision, documentation, and the undeniable power of the truth. We had built an alliance, set a trap, and methodically executed a plan that brought not just victory, but justice. And in the end, the peace I had sought when I first bought this land was finally real, made all the more precious by the battle it had taken to secure it. The lake shimmered in the late afternoon sun, a vast expanse of serene, untroubled water. It was finally ours.